Hello everyone and welcome to the second of this sort of double header of the archaeology papers from archaeology staff here at the University of Chester. Today we're going to be hearing from Dr Morn Capper and Professor Howard Williams. Both are going to give us a short overview of some sort of research that they've been working on recently. Both papers will take place and then we'll have the opportunity for questions at the end. But first of all, we will turn to Dr Morn Capper and her presentation, Rethinking the Medieval in the Midlands and the March. Morn, over to you.
Thanks very much, Cara, and it's really great to have the chance to talk to members of the department about research, because this is something this department does really well. And what I'd like to do is to talk about two different sorts of research. So the first sort of research I'm going to talk about is my own research, on which I am working collaboratively with individuals outside the university, but also my own research. And the second example I'd like to talk about is some student-led and student-centred research in which students have the opportunity to engage with what we do as archaeologists and heritage professionals and to gain some skills of their own, and perhaps think about the ways in which it's so beneficial to have that engagement between students and the research environment. And some of the things I'm not going to say will be said in the questions afterwards, and it would be really great to have some engagement from students on how this can work better for them, but also, and more importantly, to perhaps make them an offer they may not be able to refuse. So I'd like to talk about rethinking the medieval in the Midlands and the March from two very different perspectives. I've formerly worked directly on Chester campus, and a number of you students will know me from there. I've also, since that time, been working at UCS Shrewsbury and for the University of Chester campus there. So I'm going to introduce that project in a little bit. My research interests, for those of you who haven't met me before, are Mercia and the Making of Power. That's a forthcoming book. Medieval Regional Identities, Past and Present, for which I've done a range of work, including working with the Staffordshire Hoard. Museums and heritage practice and the ways in which our built environment can become more sustainable. This is a critical interest of mine, and it's part of my current work on the afterlife of castles, by which I mean what happens to castles during and after they cease to be fortifications in the landscape. And the reason I'm doing this is because I think if you take a longer perspective, looking both before and after castles have that period of prominence, you may get a better sense of how they can be looked after better as part of our built environment. I'm very interested in Students as Partners research, and I'm part of the Students as Partners network at Chester. And I'm also very interested in innovation and partnership. I like to work on public engagement, and I'm very keen to work with professionals and what I would call skilled amateurs who have that professional knowledge and amateur knowledge, which enables them to have input into the types of work that we do. So, for example, I do quite a lot with work with reenactors, with field walkers, and people who, in fact, even practice medieval martial arts for a living, so that I can engage more fully with the ways in which the medieval world becomes three-dimensional to us, and the ways in which it can become haptic and you can actually touch it. My first piece of work is on the life and love and, in fact, death of AETHELFLAEDAN, Lady of the Mercians. AETHELFLAEDAN, Lady of the Mercians is a relatively well-known character in the Midlands, but perhaps not outside. She is the eldest daughter of King Alfred of Wessex. She was born around 871, early in the Viking period. And the reason I'm interested in her is that, like many women of the age, she was very much defined by her male relationships. She was defined by her father, King Alfred of Wessex, her husband, Athelred, Lord of the Mercians, who had submitted to her father's overlordship to achieve his alliance. And then, obviously, in time, she became known as a widow. Now, the reason I'm interested in AETHELFLAEDAN is that my wider research has been interested in the nature of the making of Mercian power. And yet here in AETHELFLAEDAN, we have not once but twice an opportunity for succession that doesn't happen. A time when, instead of moving on to the next available male ruler, you end up with the choice being made to go for a female ruler, in despite of perhaps a lack of that potential military kind of impact, and the way in which women are viewed at this time is somewhat problematic. So when I think about AETHELFLAEDAN, Lady of the Mercians, the reason that she's of interest to me is that the image that she presents to us as a female leader and war leader is very much managed and I think reworked even in the post-conquest period. And so I have my two interests there, one in terms of understanding the gender of Aethelflaed and her role in as a war leader, interacting with my interest in the Mercian landscape, because one of the huge things that happens in Aethelflaed's day is that Mercia, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, becomes divided. Half of that becomes placed under Viking and Scandinavian rule in a range of towns, which we might call the 5 or 7 boroughs. And then on the other side, we have the creation of a new polity, one which hasn't previously existed, a West Mercian polity, and one with a vast, and I mean around about 500 miles long boundary to it. So you have a political entity, which I know very well, being fractured and remade on at least 2 occasions during her lifetime. And I find this very interesting in terms of the fact that as a result of this, in part, she is actually enabled to succeed her husband as ruler of the Mercians between 911 and 918, and then to move on from there, leading a military campaign in offensive terms, and in fact against the Welsh as well, in order to preserve her people and to reconquer some of those areas of Mercia that have been lost. And I'd like to specify the difference between what she's doing there and between that and her brother, who in the Viking Age is very much conquering Viking East Anglia from people to whom he had ceded it by treaty and from whom in an area he had never actually ruled before. So there are 2 very different things going on there. So Aethelflaed as a ruler, Aethelflaed as a woman, you can see from this, these are much later 13th century manuscripts. We don't even really know what she looked like. And as I was working on this idea, I spoke to colleagues and colleagues at other universities, and particularly Philip Morgan and Andrew Sargent at Keele and Charlie Inslee, and also Charlie Inslee at Manchester and myself. We came to the view that this was really a very understudied phenomenon and we ought to talk more about it. So the views of Aethelflaed in the past are very interesting to me because in her own day, at her own death, she was called in the Annals of Ulster the most famous, the very famous Aethelflaed, Queen of the Saxons. But in the Mercian Register, which was her own local chronicle, she was called Lady of the Mercians. And yet in her brother's Winchester Chronicle, she's referred to as Aethelflaed, his sister. And it's this idea of women as either relations or in fact as exceptional, which I found particularly difficult when dealing with Aethelflaed. So if you follow up with William of Malmesbury in the 12th century, and you consider the impact, obviously, of the reign of King Stephen and other things on accelerating this, you've got a bit of a sense that it's almost an accident that she becomes a ruler, and in a way, making her exceptional becomes the trope through which her actual building of power and the realistic experience of her power is actually being affected. So in this case, William of Malmesbury says, and that's died, sorry. William of Malmesbury says, we must not overlook the king's sister Aethelflaed, the widow of Ealdam and Aethelred. So she's the king's sister, she's the widow already. She was a virago, a very powerful influence on her brother's policy and no less effective as a builder of cities. So he then goes on to say, it would be hard to say whether it was luck or character that made a woman of such a tower of strength for the men of her own side and such a terror to the rest. And this was quite an infuriating comment to me, not only because, as usual in medieval sources, she was introduced in the context of her relatives, but also by being identified as a virago, as I and other authors have stated. She was being identified with a saintly term that made her less than a woman, i.e. it framed her as a man, a virago, a powerful influence on her brother's policy, i.e. she didn't have one herself, no less effective as a builder of cities, but it's this question of luck or character, the idea that she has no judgment of her own, and we don't know whether it was luck or character that made her such a tower of strength for the men on her own side. It's my view that we can find out whether or not Aethelflaed was a great supporter of her brother, a powerful factor in the conquest of Viking Mercia, for reasons that had everything to do with her own character and her own strategy and the strategy of the Mercian people. And in fact, were not entirely overruled by this question of exceptionalism, which often comes up. So we've got these various narratives that appear in the historiography that I think need reconsideration. the narratives of unity and of purpose in King Alfred's kingdom, narratives of female virtue and exceptionalism, and this question of whether it's realistic to be able to either write women off as exceptional, or especially in terms of war leadership, or whether we have to be a little careful not to expect them to have modern freedoms in a medieval context. And so I came up with two papers here, one of which is the paper on AETHELFLAEDAN Frontiers, which addresses the making of Aethelflaed's kingdom as both a new and an old Mercian kingdom. The question of these Mercian West Saxon alliances is a very geographical question. The local Viking and Welsh populations as actually opportunities for her rule, which she comes to use, and the reshaping of Mercian borderlands, landscapes and seascapes to configure a very short-lived, but I think very interesting version of the Mercian kingdom. In particular, within this, we have the roots of physical and spiritual defence, and I think through evaluation of her fortifications, but also the pre-existing Mercian kingdom in these areas, you can see, I think, a sense that she understood the landscape she had inherited, and that she was then able to weaponise that and use that, but also to embark on several processes which led to her actually taking the submission of the Viking town of Leicester, and also the Vikings from the Northumbrian kingdom later on. And the reason for this being, I think, that due to the physical geography and the nature of this kingdom that she'd created, she perhaps had slightly different perspectives from this Aethelflaedan borderland than did either her husband Athelred, her father Alfred, or in fact her brother Edward. I think this is something Edward loses. The second thing that this made me want to think about is under what terms is female leadership and war leadership in particular acceptable in the medieval world. We know that, and I'm going to speak on this at the IMC in July this year, these question of the ties by which she is known, the things that bind power, her kin, her king, her relationships. In particular, I talked in my second paper about the authority and life stages which she had, and the way in which, in some cases, we have what we would call female visibility in warfare, be it in question of the Berker Graves, so for example, examples of women who are essentially warriors versus women who are potentially war leaders, and some women potentially being both, and whether or not females are visible. And as I've said, this idea of viragos and exceptionalism, the ways in which, rather than talking about how they did build loyalty and lordship, we instead tend to discuss how they were so exceptional and it was so unusual. Increasingly, I think, especially in discussions of nobility in the 10th and 11th centuries, we see that there are some times when female war leadership is not only acceptable but encouraged, and that warfare must therefore be a learned responsibility that women have to understand in order to learn about it, in order to practice it, in order to lead effectively. And in this article, I talk a lot about the ways in which Aethelflaed learned statecraft and the ways in which she was present in circumstances that would have allowed her to have a strong understanding of the Mercian landscape. Let's remember she was born in Wessex, in the middle of Wessex, in fact, and also that this learned knowledge, which she learned with her Mercian, from her Mercian community, would have enabled her to practice warfare in a strategic way, not by accident, as William of Malmesbury claims. In addition, we have, I think, a bigger question, which is contextual. And so, by what right or what necessity are women allowed to rule? Are they allowed to lead in warfare? And I actually was a very interesting conference just this weekend in which we were talking about when did it not become acceptable for women to talk about and to be heavily engaged in matters of strategy and warfare. So is it just about by right, or is it by necessity? Is it more about what parts of society you come from than whether or not you are male or female? That is to say, if a woman is exceptionally good at warfare, how did she come to that? It cannot be that it dropped out of the sky. If it isn't divinely inspired, how is it inspired? How do you learn that statecraft? These types of discussions led us to a public-facing conference. And unusually for an academic conference, we framed this conference by presenting it in Tamworth Assembly Rooms, myself, Charlie Inslee, with a lot of help, and I'd like to thank him, from Richard Morgan at Keele, and also Andrew Sargent. So due to these factors, there were many other anniversary kind of anniversary celebrations going on in 2018. In Shrewsbury, ironically, we're mostly celebrating Wilfred Owen, but elsewhere it became pretty clear that people were very keen to commemorate AETHELFLAED. And in a way, these kind of stimulations of anniversary celebration are very much what my heritage work is about. And so I was following this for a second paper at the Institute for Historical Research. So the first paper here, as you can see, we did at Tamworth Assembly Rooms. We had a 2-day conference, and this in particular enabled public and private engagement. So we were open to members of the public to attend. We had very good attendance. And alongside this, we ran a museum display within Tamworth Castle Museum, and we engaged fully with the discussions that were going on there, and also worked with the archives. As I said, my second paper at the International Conference for Historical Geographers in Prague dealt and addressed directly some of these issues I was finding with the celebration of AETHELFLAEDAN kind of anniversaries, the ways in which medieval relics and modern identities were ending up intertwined, and drawing from my work on the Staffordshire Hoard, the fact that Mercia had this regional identity potential that made it a potential tourist commodity seemed really to spring into action. And the way in which it did this in 2018 was quite interesting. And these are 2 points I wanted to make from that paper. First of which, the media invisibility of mature women, I think, is very interesting. Establishing, obviously, that AETHELFLAED was born in around 871, the way in which she was being depicted by only blonde women, and preferably under the age of 30, I found difficult, and perhaps others would like to chat with me about the ways in which females of competence and maturity are tending to be depicted as younger and younger and younger women. Obviously, young women are equally capable of leadership, etc. But I'm wanting to know, why is this part of sexualizing female heroic figures? I don't know why this woman is wearing this dress. And also, it's worthwhile considering another process, which Hughes Hallett mentions, the process of heroization, whereby heroes, characters, curricula vitae are adjusted to suit our modern moral values and the emotional needs of those who adore them. So are we therefore uncritical of our heroic figures? And she uses Achilles, but I think this is very relevant here for a woman like AETHELFLAED of Mercia. You know, are we willing to acknowledge where she does things which are actually potentially not you know, what we would have her do from a point of view of a historical character? Are we too willing to make people into heroes and then to not look for some of the realities of what decisions they're forced into? This anniversary caused quite a lot of furore at various points. There were various comments in the Spectator, which I think showed people drawing her case to the values that they wanted to represent. And this one is Brexit. You could call her the first Brexiteer. I don't know why they think that at all. She's spending most of her time talking to Scandinavians as well as English, and certainly, as we know, England in this period is very well connected. And obviously, Howard Williams in the department, who will speak later, has very much discussed the nature of perspectives on the Anglo-Saxon period, and I'm using it as a period here very specifically. I could say early medieval period, but in importance, the ways in which this gets used in modern tropes, which I'm sure he would be able to discuss further. So outputs from this then, I was advisor on the 2021 Battle and Tribute Gallery, HLF funded at Tamworth Castle Museum. I am doing an IHR paper, The Hidden History of Women and Power, Conversations with AETHELFLAED, Lady of the Mercians, and I'm also contributor and editor for the AETHELFLAED conference volume due out in 2018. Second piece of research I'd like to bring to you, and I won't dwell on it too much, but the reason I'm bringing it here is because of the very different nature of this research. It's student engaged research. Even the people who are in this picture who aren't actually students at the start of the dig, by the end of it, I have to say, we're either Shrewsbury students or, in fact, in the case of the last at the front, have just graduated with very good degrees in museums practice. Likewise, this is student engaged research, so I'd like to talk a little bit about what students can get out of this. I'd like to also pay close attention to the idea of partnership here, and this is part of what UCS does. This is a partnership piece of work between Nigel Baker, Archaeology, to whom I would like to note the ways in which he is importantly responsible for leading on this project, the University Centre Shrewsbury, the Castle Studies Trust, who are our funders, Shropshire Council, who provide all the equipment, which is very helpful, and also Shropshire Museum and Art Gallery, Shrewsbury Museum and Art Gallery Shropshire Museum Service, and the archives in Shrewsbury, both of whom play a fantastic role in enabling our students. It was an important part of this research that students led on some of the interpretation for public events and open days. It was because they'd done work-based learning placements in those locations that they were able to do this work with such efficacy. And also I'd like to thank the students, because we had a very good uptake onto masters in the years since we've started this project. And the other thing I'd like to point out in terms of the students is that without their efforts and their willingness to engage with this type of a project, we wouldn't be here and we wouldn't be able to do what we were doing. And in addition, again, I'd like to mention the endless enthusiasm of the castle staff, including the staff and volunteers of the Soldiers of Shropshire Museum, all of whom were very willing to engage with our students and provide us with various practical support. The University Centre Shrewsbury then is an institution which is a collaboration between Chester and Shropshire Council in response to a hefty cold spot analysis. And the curriculum there is designed to use the town as a campus and to engage students with the cultural capital of Shrewsbury, Shropshire and the March. Now, the intention of this is to animate teaching, but also to enrich the student experience. And since 2018, since my arrival, we've been involved in curriculum redesign to emphasise the greater student engagement, gain practical and relevant experience and skills, and to develop the kind of transferable skills which we think make MSc Museums Practice, MSc Heritage Practice postgraduate and public history undergraduate students more saleable, but also enable them to create networks and experiences which enhance their employability before they even get out of the degree. It was set up on a civic university model, the importance of universities being central to the places in which they are and the way in which they can support the community. But I think we've always taken on board the citizen-student approach, the idea that students and graduates, and especially widening participation students, can build social capital and have opportunities to contribute to their communities, to provide skills and expertise, and the connections that enable them to navigate change, as Chester Students' Union would put it. However, also beyond that, we've got holistic life experiences, student experiences, opportunities beyond the classroom, and the idea that learning should be more personal and more flexible than it perhaps is always during the curriculum. And the fact that this is a volunteering research project is an important one. And in order to widen participation, we made sure that all projects within the department are based in the town centre and have no travel costs associated for students at Shrewsbury. And we've also been very careful to make sure that we're very flexible around the way that students volunteer for this project. Some only do 1 day or 2 days. Sometimes they stay for a whole week. But the important point is to make sure that, especially with widening participation and mature students, that we're able to make sure that those students are able to contribute in a way that suits them. And that, I think, is important. To explain a little about the castle, in Tudor times, we can see the castle here, and it's important to consider the ways in which Shrewsbury hasn't really changed that much since around about the Tudor period. This is a map of an atlas from William Cecil Lord Burghley, annotated in his own hand in probably the 1570s and available from the British Library. And in fact, I've given this to students before and they've used it as a map to navigate modern Shrewsbury town centre. It really hasn't changed that much. Within this, you can see the two bridges of the town, which are mentioned in Henry I's confirmation charters. You can see the pre-conquest churches of St Mary towards the right, then St Alkmund and St Juliana's, and then on the left, St Chad's in its old position. We're going to graduate next week from St Chad's in its new position. And these are on hills, and the third hill is occupied by Shrewsbury Castle, which is here at the neck of the isthmus of this kind of neck of land. It's defended naturally by the river, as well as being defended across the neck of the land by a wall these days, the town wall. It's worthy of consideration then that the gap across that is something like 200 metres. It's not a lot, and the hill on which the castle stands has an excellent kind of command over that position. If you look towards the top right of the picture, you can see that the road leading out down Castle Four Gates is the only way on and off what is effectively almost an island. And it's important to mention that there is hoard evidence from down that road which suggests that it's been there as long as there's been occupation, obviously within the river loop. So the abbey, founded by Roger de Montgomery in 1095, is kind of at the top of the picture, and sorry, it's at the bottom of the picture as you're looking at it. And as we've mentioned, that would be days before his death, but in general, what we're looking at is the castle itself. So let's go and look at that. So the structure of the town hasn't changed significantly. It is therefore still a very important and prominent landmark within what in Tudor times would have been a recognisable landscape. When we look at the castle itself, then, we've got pre-conquest royal rights as evidenced in Domesday, which include the importance of the town sending armed men to support the king and to go with him and chaperone him when hunting or travelling in the area. So we can imagine that it still is an important site in terms of low relations with the Welsh. During Domesday, we have a mention which I'll come back to, but before that, the town was burned and the castle held out against Edric the Wild, who was a local nobleman who was leading a rebellion against Norman occupation after 1066. In that process then, the castle, which you can see here, would have been critical to the holding of the town, and as we said, the castle held out and the town burned. Edric the Wild and the townsfolk were unable to take the town itself. And if you compare what I've said about AETHELFLAEDAN previously and the way that she's building burhs and defending all her people, this Norman site is being used to impose authority on the landscape. So looking at the site that you can see there, at Domesday, the people complained that it was very hard on them. They struggled to pay their taxes because 252 properties had paid tax before the Norman conquest, but 51 were destroyed during the creation of the castle. And Roger de Montgomery built the castle sometime between 1070 and 1080. If you look directly above, however, you can see that this is platform 3 of Shrewsbury train station, and it's fairly obvious that the arrival of the railroad in the 19th century has had a massive effect on this site, and we still don't really know as of yet the effect of the large goods trains running past the top of the site there. If you look to the left, you can see the train station itself, which is overlooked by Henry III's hall, and we can see there that below that there is a car park and so forth, which are critical to modern Shrewsbury infrastructure. So when you arrive in Shrewsbury on the train, on public transport, you literally arrive on top of, or in fact the castle is on top of you, and you can normally see it when you're coming and going from platform 3. If you look towards the top right of your picture, however, you can see the effect of the river. Now, in the time of Henry II, the Motte and Bailey Castle, which had been produced by Roger de Montgomery in the 1070s or so, was replaced in stone, and we can see from the King's works and in fact the pipe roll evidence that this wall is being rebuilt in stone. And then by the time of Henry III, we've got the building of a chamber and Torellas, which you can see there as the main building which soldiers of Shropshire now inhabits. Now, a relevant point here is the way in which we sometimes don't have evidence for what may have happened here. In 1102, Roger de Montgomery's son, Robert de Bellem, rebelled against the king, and the castle and his lands in Shropshire were forfeited to the crown. A royalist, at the anarchy of King Stephen in 1138, the castle was taken for Queen Matilda by the county sheriff, who tried to hold it, but he then lost it to King Stephen's forces. Now, an interesting question within the castle walls then is, in what order do these events occur, but also where exactly can we see evidence of this in the physical structure? For example, the Gesta Stephani, which is the relevant literary source, doesn't describe the attack or the siege of Shrewsbury at all, really. And so we are lacking that evidence in the historical sources, but in the archaeological record, you can see, looking in front of you, that some things have happened to the castle that are quite interesting. For one, if you look in the clump of trees to the right, you can see that there is a motte there, largely invisible now, and if you look just to the left of that clump of trees, between the postern gate at the top and the main gate at the bottom, there's a kind of slightly curved dark line which enables you to see the line of the mott ditch of the Motte and Bailey Castle, now almost invisible. So obviously you can see in the middle of this picture we had drone footage taken of the trench that we were doing, which was trench 1, and then to the left there you've got the building that is Henry III. Now, one of the important relevant questions here has always been, well, what happened inside this building? Inside this scheduled ancient monument. We also know that the effect of this river on the right-hand side hasn't been entirely passive, because around about 1269 to 1271, there was a wooden tower which fell into the river, and prior to that, we've got by 1255, there is significant damage to the motte by the river. And of course, it's blamed, like many other things, on the abbot of the abbey across the river, and that's not really surprising. But what it does mean is that the top of the motte as it exists now has a very unusual shape, and on top of that shape you can see the tower that was built by Thomas Telford on the top, Laura's Tower, and Laura's Tower is obviously a kind of a folly in effect, but it's built on the base of a tower that was probably built by Edward I, or certainly reconstructed by Edward I. So if we look on the Ordnance Survey map, you can see quite easily that the top of the motte there has actually been more or less sliced in half by the river, and you can see also the effect that's had on the shape of the top of the motte. I'll come back to that. On the 1882 Ordnance Survey map as well, just in front of the castle and to the left as you look at it, you can see a set of buildings in the castle grounds, and those buildings in the castle grounds are essentially an apparent Methodist chapel, probably more towards the wall, and then also a Victorian greenhouse. Now, the one thing we were fairly aware of is that, as Nigel Baker indicated, in his discussion when we were talking to Historic England about why we would be able to dig here, if we look at the ground penetrating radar on the left-hand side, you can see a couple of quite clear targets potentially. The first is this patch in front of the building itself. The second is a patch to the left, as kind of an L shape of a building there. Again, a patch of high resistivity, and a third patch right at the very bottom in pink on your picture there, that sits around the current site of the castle well. So the first 2 seasons that we aimed for, the first season was to address this large patch in front of the castle building here. The second patch was to address this L-shaped anomaly, and the intentionality here was to try and identify some of the structures that we had previously seen in our kind of looking at the documents, one of which was obviously this building, which you can see below where it says Castrum, and this second building to the left of where it says Castrum with no roofs on by the time of the Tudor period. What were those buildings? Is one of them the Chapel of St Michael? And the second thing is to identify what happens in the records that we have from the pipe rolls, which talk about a large amount of expenditure in the building, but are normally very, very sparse on what exactly it is that the money is being spent on. So we know there's been a lot of modification within this site, but there's a real building use case here for heritage management, because in addition to it being the first time archaeology was undertaken on the site, it was also original research and a contribution of knowledge, and then also the conservation plans for the castle itself are directly affected by this activity, because the castle itself is actually rather unusable as a fully scheduled ancient monument. Its potential for well-being, for green access space in the town centre of Shrewsbury is very limited, but also its potential in terms of heritage management and questions around the regional visitor and tourism economy needed to be addressed in order to enable best use of the site and a plan for the conservation of its future. In addition to that point, a vast amount of what I was doing was ensuring that the students who were engaged in digging were getting something back reciprocally for that engagement. And this included a range of practical experiences, both of excavation, but also of partnership work, of social media management, and of learning and using the skills that would be involved in a large project. So in addition to all the digging and excavation that you can see here, and as you can see at the top, one of our prize-winning students, Victoria, engaging as an archaeologist in planning some of the site, We also had quite a lot of media attention, managing the media attention. The students were engaged in blogging and in writing WordPress accounts. And also they took the lead on 2 public-facing events, which were the Open Day and also kind of a VIP's Open Day, in which we presented some of the issues we were finding in terms of the excavation and the learning about the history of the castle to members of the kind of the partners and stakeholders of the site. And I think this was very useful because in these terms, in terms of community, the students gained additional extracurricular project, working with staff and professional contexts to engage with local heritage professionals, National Trust, volunteers, each other. And this was very important in terms of, I think, in the terms of the students looking towards being able to become potential postgraduate students. Another point that was useful is in terms of professionalism. So the students got to see their own lecturers as professionals to apply the theory that they'd learned in their courses, and their courses on Normans, for example, in practice, and to enhance their understanding of professional practice in academia and in the sector. They got to the opportunities to gain experiences which not only have led to collaboration and that contextualise their current curriculum, but also enabled the students to enhance their relationships with the programme team, to develop skills and social capital, and importantly, to achieve skills which for some of them, having been out of work for some time or potentially having been in education for some time, showed their responsibilities and their capabilities and their transferable skills and their responsibility in terms of teaching, even, you know, responses to children and public facing skills and you know, kind of personal management of themselves in a professional context, which I think were really, really critical in terms of students having things to put on CVs and in terms of job applications. And certainly for the postgraduates, several of the students involved in this project have already moved on to employment, sometimes even before finishing the course, which can be a little bit of a challenge. And as mentioned, this has been very important for contributions to professional networks, contributions to actual interim reports and so forth, student benefit in public engagement and in skills development and media management, but also the better civic benefits of them being able to enhance their profile in terms of local and national media coverage. I think we had 3 million hits. We were on West Midlands Today. We were regularly appearing in various newspapers, and it also raised profile for the partnership and for UCS, as well as, I think, embedding us all professionally in networks which, you know, we were somewhat latecomers to. And the way in which we've been supported in this work and the way in which we've been able to do things like putting the student exhibitions in local libraries and archives, and to be able to have students, and just for example, the student in the picture is currently working as a building specialist in Shropshire 2 years later, to have students who had those real life experiences and wherever they were coming from, to be able to say that they had experience in a professional capacity, being able to get the gold and silver Chester Volunteering Awards, and good references and CV skills. And so the difference, and I think the importance between these two, and I can talk about some of this material later, is that the student voice is that it's a new experience for them, exceptionally rewarding, and it gives them a sense of pride. We've now had repeated successful funding bids and presented this work to the Students as Partners specialist network within the University of Chester. But also, the students said, I would definitely do it again. And I would challenge them for that, because we are seeking further funding for the 2022 season. And I can report more on that after the break. Thank you very much.